breakfast this morning?
Honey nut meat, please.
Victoria and Kimberly Ramanoop live with their parents and baby brother Thomas in Tower Hamlets in East London. They both suffer from the same chronic illness.
Like my breakfast, yum, yum, yum.
There you are, girls.
Victoria and Kimberly were diagnosed with having asthma when they was about 18 months. I think the main cause of asthma is the pollution, hereditary, dust. It's quite confusing with what you read in the papers and that. Every little thing you read, you worry.
Like, if you read everything what the paper says, you'll be worried. Oh, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. You must take real precaution on everything, but you can't really go on what the paper says all the time.
Unfortunately, many other children like Victoria and Kimberly also suffer from asthma. So what research and statistics can families like the Ramanoops go on to find out what's causing asthma in their children? How do we pick our way through the maze of messages about what might cause a disease, in this case asthma? The study of where and how often disease occurs is known as epidemiology, and it's an evolving science. It all began in the 19th century, when Britain was plagued by a deadly epidemic, cholera, which many people at the time believed to be an airborne disease. John Snow fought to prove the real reason for its spread. John Snow was a pioneering epidemiologist who, through his work in the crowded and polluted streets of central London in the mid-19th century, established the link between cholera and water. In doing so, he put epidemiology firmly on the map. What did people think before John Snow's work was the cause of cholera?
I think the predominant theory was that it was some kind of miasma, that it was in some way related to filthy environments. They thought that smells were particularly likely to spread disease. And where they would have cases of obvious infection, they would sometimes burn sulfur to fumigate the rooms. So if you like, they were replacing this foul atmosphere with what they hoped would be a disease-free one.
But John Snow didn't believe it was in the air. As a practicing doctor, he'd seen many patients and believed that diseases could be passed on from sick people to healthy ones in the form of some contaminated material. In the case of cholera, with its symptoms of severe vomiting and diarrhea, he thought that the contaminated material was the feces of the sick and that this was getting into the city's water supply. So when healthy people drank the water, they got the disease. In the early 19th century, Londoners were supplied with water by a number of private companies who pumped it from the Thames to their homes, or they used communal street pumps. But as well as supplying drinking water, the Thames was also the dumping ground for a lot of London's sewage.
When he suggested that it would be something carried in the water, this was really strange to them. You see, it was years before the germ theory, and people had actually said that the idea of miniature little things living inside you was disgusting, as well as obviously false. And so the concept of someone touching you like this and giving you a disease, that was very understandable and had been accepted since ancient times. But the idea that it could be transmitted indirectly by water to you in tiny invisible things, that was very strange.
A terrible cholera outbreak had hit London in 1848 and 49. Snow made a close study of the death statistics from this outbreak, which was supplied to him by William Farr, the Registrar General. He discovered that people living in areas supplied with water by the Southwark and Vauxhall Water Company were far more likely to die from cholera than people living in areas supplied by other water companies. And those supplied by the Lambeth Company also experienced a high number of deaths. Snow knew that both the Southwark and Vauxhall Company and the Lambeth Company drew their water from the same sewage-filled stretch of the Thames.
And then one of the water companies started taking their water from a better part of the Thames. It was the Lambeth Company moved their abstraction point further up to Thames Ditton, where the water was relatively unsewage contaminated. And they did this about 1853.
The following year, 1854, London again suffered a major cholera outbreak. It was an opportunity for Snow to put his water theory to the test.
When the major outbreak occurred in 1854, Snow realised that he had what he called the crucial experiment, i.e. the natural experiment, we'd call it now, where just by chance people arrange things so that some people drink foul water and other people don't. And there it was. There was the central part of London with some houses supplied by the Lambeth Company and some still supplied by the Vauxhall and Southwark Company. Now he knew that the Lambeth Company had moved. He had already the hypothesis of water. It meant that he started off, if you like, with a big advantage. Otherwise, it's what we call a fishing expedition, which is what most investigations of cholera were like at that time.
As well as again studying death statistics, Snow set about personally testing his theory. He embarked on a door-to-door survey to find out the source of each victim's drinking water.
He had help. In fact, the local curate proved to be quite a helpful assistant, and one can well imagine that Snow, who was a rather bossy Yorkshireman by all accounts, would have said to the curate and anyone else who was around, well, you go around each house, lad, and you'll ask them what water they have, what they do for a living, have they had any deaths, have they been drinking it? He was very systematic. We need these questions answered. So there was a lot of doorstepping, or shoe leather epidemiology, we call it today. And it's still very much what we would commend young epidemiologists to do, is there's nothing like visiting the scene of the crime.
John Snow made systematic records of everything he and the curate discovered.
He didn't map it as he went along. It would appear that he kept all the names and addresses, and then when he was writing up his evidence, he included the maps as special evidence. And what he did was he showed the number of deaths per house or per establishment as little black blocks.
Armed with his survey and the death statistics, Snow set about tracing the source of the cholera outbreak around Golden Square.
He saw very soon on that where there were lots of pumps around the area, because unfortunately not everybody had a pipe supply, there was one pump here that appeared to have a lot of cases. So he had two things going on. He had the rival water supplies, one which was more foul than the other, and he also appeared to have pumps, one of which might be more foul. And so he thought, I have another grand experiment. This pump must be in some way contaminated. He had the kind of mind that was able to look at outlying cases, things that don't fit. Like in any good detective story, what doesn't fit? For instance, the cases in the brewery, there weren't any.
Even though it was quite nearby.
Quite nearby. And he made inquiries and found that they had their own well. So they didn't use either the piped water or the local pump. And you can imagine how exciting it must have been as he realised, this is it, I've got the proof. There was another fascinating case. Now we call it the widow of Hampstead. There was a very successful percussion cap maker called Ely. And when he died, his widow had enough money to move up the hill to a posher part of town, to just down the hill from Hampstead. But she missed the water because the Broad Street pump was famed for the sweetness of its water and the clarity of its water. So she would send down for it every day. And the only case that occurred in Hampstead was the widow of Ely, the percussion cap maker. So those were very strong pieces of evidence. And even today, because of that wonderful example that Snow had the genius to realise how important that was, we say, where's the outlying case?
Where's the widow of Hampstead?
Yes.
Snow's study was so compelling that the authorities were finally persuaded to close the pump at the centre of the outbreak in Broad Street by removing its handle.
So this pink granite curbstone marks the site of the original pump that was the centre of all the attention in the Broad Street.
Just this?
I know, it's not very impressive. They have got a little plaque over there that commemorates it, but only recently they have put up a replica of the pump over here, which is a little bit more impressive. So this is the replica of the pump, a bit more easy to take in than the pink curbstone. The handle would have been attached here, and by leaving the handle off, which of course they would have yanked up and down to make the water come out, it's very symbolic, because what it's saying is this was a public health intervention. probably one of the most dramatic achievements in public health of all time, and certainly of the 19th and 20th centuries. Rather a shame that it's only got this very small memorial.
And you wonder how many of the people going past even notice it, actually.
They'd certainly notice if cholera was in their water supply, though.
Even though the parish had acted on the Broad Street pump, and despite Snow's evidence, it wasn't until 1858 that the government was finally forced to do something about the country's failing water and sewage networks. During the summers of 1858 and 59, the polluted Thames produced a smell so foul it became known as the Great Stink. The politicians inside the Houses of Parliament could only bear to carry on by hanging disinfected sheets in the windows. Perhaps it was a case of the miasma theory having the last laugh. John Snow proved cholera wasn't something in the air, but the Ramanuk family wonder if pollution in London's air today could have anything to do with Victoria and Kimberley's asthma.
I think it's all to do with what's in the air.
If it's too hot, that triggers it off as well. If you get a very warm day.
Yeah, sometimes, often the cold weather as well, and the pollution.
Yeah, you have to wear them because in case the weather turns cold again.
A number of scientists are currently investigating the nature of the air that we breathe. Dr. Paul Aylin is an epidemiologist from Imperial College doing research into the health implications of air pollution at St Mary's Hospital.
John Snow, often cited as the father of epidemiology, used maps to try and establish a relationship between his exposure, his source of polluted water, and the cholera outbreak. Very much like John Snow, we too use maps to look at exposures such as air pollution and try and relate that to outcomes such as respiratory disease and asthma.
When we went to Spain and when we went to America,
Yeah.
the girls didn't suffer with their chests at all. I mean,
Probably could do it the warm weather.
yeah, I think that could be it,
Yeah.
because a few times I didn't, you know, when you're on holiday, you don't forget, but she didn't take them, her inhalers, and they were both fine. But as soon as we get back to England,
I don't know what it is, but
it started again.
I think it's just a
I think it's the
enclosed pollution
warmness.
and the sort of humidity in the place. Making me feel hungry.
And plus there's so many people live in England, and especially London.
It's just like you're living in a bubble and there is no breathing space. Whereas like when you go on holidays, everything seems to be wide open and basically carefree.
Epidemiologists are trying to look at air pollution using two approaches. The first approach is to look at time trends. And we look at air pollution over time and look to see where there are peaks of air pollution, to see whether these coincide with peaks of ill health. The second way of looking at air pollution from an epidemiological point of view is to look at geographical differences in air pollution. And we look at areas where there are high levels of pollution, compare that with areas where there are lower levels of pollution, and see whether there are differences in ill health. I think there certainly is a relationship between air pollution and asthma. One study looked at an industrial area, a steel mill, which shut down temporarily, and the rates of asthma and respiratory admissions in preschool children halved at that time. So I think there is a relationship. Whether it actually causes the asthma or whether it aggravates it, we just don't know at the moment.
In researching the nature of the link between air pollution and asthma, epidemiologists like Paul need to be aware of several statistical factors that could cloud their results.
Now, first of all, you've got to think about chance and whether a high rate of pollution simply coincides with a high rate of poor health, just by chance. The second thing you've got to think about when interpreting these results is what we call confounding, and that is whether there are other things in the area that are causing the ill health. So, for instance, when you're looking at poor health around an industrial installation, you often find that the residential areas around there are quite socially deprived. And we know already that in poorer areas, people tend to have poorer health. The other things you've also got to look at are whether the information that we're getting is accurate. We look at it in terms of bias of the study. So is the information that we have on pollution accurate? Are the monitors around the area recording the pollution accurately? And only then, after you've excluded those three things, can you think about a causal relationship between the air pollution and people's poor health.
So there may eventually be found to be a link between air pollution and the growing number of children suffering from asthma. But not all researchers are convinced that it's something in the air.
Kimberly, how often do you use your inhaler?
Just loads a week. Twice. It's twice a day. That's what Victoria said. Shut up.
Back in the 1850s, John Snow was investigating an acute infectious disease caused by the cholera bacteria, which he helped to pinpoint through his research into the way in which the illness was transmitted. But with asthma, there are so many competing factors. Is it genetic? Is it triggered by air pollution? Or is diet a significant factor? In Aberdeen, a study is underway looking at the possibility that what we eat may be a cause of asthma.
In the last 12 months, has a doctor told you that your child has eczema?
We're just at the clinic.
Sheila Fleming, a research nurse, is undertaking a spot of shoe leather epidemiology and following up on a mother and toddler involved in one of the Aberdeen University's asthma research projects.
OK, in the last 12 months, how often on average does your child eat the following foods? Fruit juice.
Every day.
Fruit.
Professor Anthony Seaton is trying to find out why so many children now have asthma.
We were searching around for possible explanations as to why this disease should have increased. And we looked at, for example, the possibility that it might be due to air pollution. In Britain, in the 1950s, there was a great deal of air pollution.
A movie-turned cameraman drove through fog-shrouded London to report on the traffic chaos.
In terms of particles in the air, it's decreased about tenfold over the last 30 years. And over that period, asthma has got more and more common. It's very difficult to explain the rise in asthma on the basis of air pollution.
It's a menace, this choking, eye-watering smog.
So the question for Professor Seaton was, what has changed in the last 30 years that could account for this increase in asthma?
And one of the major things that's happened in Britain is that our diet has changed. And it's changed from being a very basic diet. This was the diet that we had during the war. And you notice that at the bottom it had, in our ration, unlimited vegetables, fruit, fish. People were encouraged to grow their own vegetables in their back gardens, allotments were made, and so on. And as the years have gone by, our diet has changed. It's become more sophisticated. There's much more prepared, ready prepared or partly prepared, preserved food around. And what we found when we looked at these data was that the diet had remained reasonably unchanged until about 1970, and then it took a dive. Until about 1985, according to the data, it seems that fresh vegetables, for example, on average, we were eating half as much as we had been in 1970.
Professor Seaton's examination of changes in diet over the decades has led him to suspect that vitamin E may play a particularly significant role in a healthy diet for pregnant women and young children.
What we can say is, I think, it is likely that children who eat a diet low in the foods that contain vitamin E are at greater risk of getting asthma than those who eat a diet with more of those foods in it. What we've observed are associations, and it is possible that, that diet is an important risk factor for developing asthma, but we're not sure of that. What you have to do is test the hypothesis again and again, and if you get the same result again and again, that sort of consistency makes you think there may be something in it.
Professor Seaton's epidemiological studies continue. Back in Tower Hamlets, the Ramanoop family believe their children eat a healthy diet, but they've investigated whether there may be something about their food that could have a connection to their asthma.
Victoria and Kimberly have both been for allergy tests at the hospital because when they were quite young, they just touched eggs and nuts, and then they touched their eyes, and both their eyes, they're swelled up from just touching them.
Well cooked, is it, Wen?
A bit.
A bit?
I thought you were washing it.
I was. Never mind.
Can't blame me this time.
Oh, all right then.
We wasn't quite sure if they were actually allergic to them or it's just, or not. So when we got our results back, Kimberly isn't actually allergic to them, but Victoria is.
Kids, are you all hungry?
Yeah.
What about you, Victoria?
Yeah.
When?
Yeah, I'm
Right, here we go.
just about ready.
Right.
I'm not ready. Shut up.
She can't actually eat an egg, but she can eat cakes and things like that with eggs in, but she can't actually eat the egg
Like fry eggs
by
or
itself.
boil egg by itself. No.
And when you went in after playing outside,
Victoria, what are you licking?
Meatballs.
what did you do?
That's mine. I'll give it to you back. Okay, close your eyes then. Close your eyes. Open your mouth.
My name's Patricia Kane and I'm a respiratory nurse specialist working with children and families with respiratory conditions in the Tower Hamlet area.
The girls and their brother are also the subject of some shoe leather observations in the form of Nurse Patricia Kane. From her experience, there are even more factors that could come into play.
Hi Victoria, I've come again today to see how your asthma's been over the last couple of months. How's it been for you?
It's been okay.
Good. What about at night? Have you been coughing at all?
No. Yeah.
She has. You heard her, did you? Well, shall we wait? We'll ask Victoria and then I'll come to you. Okay. Do you think you can go and get your... I think I've probably seen an increase in asthma in the Tower Hamlets area, mainly due to perhaps more diagnosis of asthma and also environmental factors such as overcrowding in homes and things like that of my client group. It's difficult to know what the causes of asthma are. It could be several things. Family history of allergy is quite a strong determiner. So Thomas, who's now 8 months, you're obviously keeping your eye on him quite closely.
Yes,
and
we are. So we're just keeping our fingers crossed that it's not going to happen.
But there are environmental factors such as smoking, which is a main one. Smoking in pregnancy as well, rise to respiratory conditions as a whole. Being more inside the home environment needs to be looked at in the sense of house dust mite obviously is another big, still a big indicator of allergy for children. That's not bad. Bit slower next time. You sound like a little doggy panting. That's very good. But the main ones are a family history, seems to be, and smoking, definitely.
That strikes a chord, at least with Wendy.
Asthma runs on my side of the family. I used to have asthma. Well, I don't get it at all now, but a lot of that was I used to smoke. But my mum, she has asthma, and my sister, she used to have asthma as well.
So the family, like other asthmatics, are aware that research is ongoing into a very large number of possible causes for their illness. Smoking, family history, pollution, diet, allergies and house mites, to name a few. An epidemiologist, Professor Sir Richard Doll, was confronted with a similar list in the late 1940s when he began exploring the possible causes of another chronic illness, lung cancer. Once again, it was thought that the cause could be something in the air.
I thought it was something to do with motor cars, and particularly perhaps with the tarring of roads. We knew that coal tar contained chemicals that could cause cancer, and of course, with the advent of cars, roads were being all tarred and smoothed, and I thought that was most likely to be the cause.
The Medical Research Council held a conference in 1947 to investigate the huge increase in lung cancer in the UK since the 1920s. They asked Professor Bradford Hill, a leading statistician, to carry out research into what was causing the explosion in these figures.
He asked me to help him, and so we designed this so-called case control study. That's to say, a study in which you ask patients with lung cancer all of the details about themselves, and then you ask people the same sex and same age, attending the same hospital preferably, similar questions, and try to see if there are any differences in their past experience. And I kept a listing of the main features of the patients with and without lung cancer. And it wasn't long before we saw this enormous difference in the cigarette smoking.
The early 20th century saw a huge rise in the numbers of people smoking, uniting men and women and social classes in a common but deadly pursuit. Didn't some medics actually give patients cigarettes to relax them?
Well, the better doctors didn't, but psychiatrists tended to.
From long experience, the doctor knows that to put people at their ease, there's nothing like a friendly cigarette.
Dole and Bradford Hill's study showed that smoking was a significant factor in the lung cancer cases, but the paper's publication wasn't generally acted upon. Together they devised a new long-term mass study.
We got British doctors to tell us their smoking habits. Altogether some 40,000 gave us details of their smoking habits, and we then began following them forward. Well, within 5 years it was quite clear that those that said they were non-smokers just didn't get lung cancer, and those that said they were smokers did in proportion to the amount that they said they smoked. The general public still were not reacting very markedly because the press and the media were still creating a belief in controversy.
Tonight's program is about the smoking habit. And I'd like to say straight away that it isn't designed to urge you to give up smoking or to cut down smoking or change your smoking habits in any way at all. That's none of our business.
Any time it was reported in the press, there was always a small article accompanying it by some other doctor that said this is a load of nonsense.
The popularity of smoking only began to decline in the early 1970s, after a number of major health warnings had been published in the 1960s, a decade after Professor Dole's. He's continued to study the 40,000 GPs who were recruited back in 1951.
Lung cancer is common as a cause of death, but then it's almost 100% fatal. And in order to see 200 or 300 people develop the disease, even if you're studying 20,000, 30,000 of them, you may have to follow them for 10, 15, 20 years before you have any appreciable numbers of lung cancers.
One day, epidemiology may answer the riddle about the true character of the cause or causes of asthma, but just like smoking, it will probably take years more dedicated methodical research and in-depth statistical analysis. But then, as the cholera and lung cancer studies show, this is the nature of good epidemiology. So, next time you read one of those shock horror stories in the papers about mobile phones or the latest food scare, look to see exactly what kinds of studies have been done. Did they compare and contrast different groups of people? Did they take into account chance, bias, and any confounding factors? And most importantly of all, did they ask the right questions in the first place? Sarah Miller is thinking about taking the biggest risk of her life, jumping from a plane at 3,500 feet. But will she go through with it? We're all constantly weighing up different risks in our everyday lives, even if generally on a slightly less dramatic scale than Sarah's. We want to make the right choices, but life can be unpredictable. So how do we decide what is or isn't a risk worth taking? No human activity is risk-free. We are constantly assessing risks and coming to decisions. Decisions relating to our own lives, to the lives of others, particularly our children, and decisions forced upon us by events beyond our control.
1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000.
Sarah's choice is a personal one, whether or not to jump out of a plane.
Function. Look.
We'll also meet Susan Azimrayat, who's making one of her first main choices for her 10-week-old daughter, whether or not she should be vaccinated. And Susan is also making decisions about her company. Decisions forced upon her by a situation beyond her control. The floods in East Sussex in October 2000. So what are the statistical secrets, if any, to making the right choices?
We have to think about making decisions on the basis of a very simple idea that I think is overwhelming. We don't know what's going to happen. I cross the street, I get married, I buy a stock, I place a bet. I have no idea what's going to happen. I can figure probabilities and likelihoods and think about it, but I don't know. Decisions have consequences, and you can't just make decisions on the probability of the outcome, because small probabilities, I cross the road against the traffic light, I'm probably not going to get run over, but if I do get run over, that's serious. So I'd wait for the light to change. In other words, we can't just make decisions on the basis of probabilities. Consequences dominate.
We make decisions by weighing up the probabilities that things will occur, the consequences of different things occurring, the consequences of different actions, and we sort of combine all those. We integrate them in our heads and then choose the least risky or the optimal or whatever the most beneficial outcome. Of course, when I say combine them, ideally we'd combine them using a mathematical formula, but we don't. We just combine them subjectively in our heads.
Sarah Miller's run through her options and considered the probabilities and decided that she really wants to do a parachute jump, despite the fact that she's scared of heights.
I got to the edge when I went abseiling, but I didn't get any further. I couldn't make myself step over the edge. I spent half an hour standing, trying to will myself to do it, and I just couldn't do it. So in the end, I gave up.
Hi there.
Hi, could I have a lottery ticket, please? Lucky dip.
I'm definitely not a risk taker. I think I'm more a safe person. Take the safe option rather than the risk side of things.
Thank you.
What charity are you raising money for, Sarah?
Macmillan Cancer Relief. So I'll bring my sponsorship form round and you can all put a little bit on, or a lot. Hi.
You all right?
Yes, thank you.
Ready?
Yes.
Head.
As well as much as I'll ever be, yeah.
Frightened or excited?
Both.
All right.
I'll be terrified tomorrow when it comes, but I think at the moment I'm okay.
Exhilarated?
Yeah.
You want to hear all about it on Monday morning?
Definitely.
She might hit the headlines yet, you know, person found in railings or scaffoldings or... So just you and...
Just me and whoever else on the course, basically.
Right. How many?
I don't know.
You might be the only female.
Oh.
I'm not sure why I want to do the jump. It's one of the crazy things that people get into their heads. Why does people do windsurfing? And it's just one thing I want to try.
Experiment.
This is probably the last time that Sarah will pick up her son Thomas from school before her skydive.
Electricity.
Very good.
How do you think she'll do?
Not very good.
Why is that?
Because she doesn't like heights. She gets seasick. She gets like airsick.
Do you think she'll do it?
No, not at all. If she does, it'll be a miracle.
Oh, nice suit.
The next day, undaunted by the weather, Sarah arrives for the intensive training course for her jump.
Arch, locate, recover, arch.
And it quickly becomes clear that she is far from being the only woman in her group.
Taking part in the parachute jump is an adventurous pursuit with the associated dangers attached to it. So it's not an armchair ride, you know, you can get hurt. You could get hurt training, you could get hurt on your parachute jump. And that could simply be a scratch, it could be as serious as a broken bone, or even worse, if you work hard enough at it, you could end up dead. So, you know, don't sit there thinking, oh, this is, you know, I'm safe, because there is an element of risk attached to taking part in this sport. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you want to do a parachute jump?
I'm Jane. Me and Hazel did a jump about 6 weeks ago, and it was absolutely fantastic. And we thought we'd got to do it again straight away, so that's why we're doing it. And I'm a teacher.
You're a teacher as well?
Yes, I have a really boring job.
The arrows.
The rainbow canopy.
Oh, it's going to be on the other.
Long way. He's flared too high now. Watch. You see how high? Watch the canopy sink down, and he'll be okay.
Oh, that's not too bad though, is it?
An increasing number of women are taking up dangerous sports such as skydiving. But perhaps surprisingly, a survey in 1991 found that more people die as a result of accidents while fishing than through taking part in air sports.
The answer just sits up on his chest when he arches. Go!
Sarah's doing a static line jump, which means that her chute should open automatically as she jumps out of the plane. However, she'll have to take control after this point, and so she has to learn the different techniques for guiding her parachute and landing safely.
Where do they show the films of the in-flight movies?
Crucially, she has to grasp the emergency malfunction drill in case she is the 1 in 750 jumpers whose parachute doesn't open properly as she leaves the plane. So she needs to know how to get rid of the faulty parachute and release the reserve one from her backpack.
3,000, 4,000, check, canopy, malfunction. Look, locate, cut, away, reserve, arch.
Well done. If you can do it when I do that to you, you can do it.
Maybe my mum can't do it.
What do you think your mum will do if she can't do it today?
Go home and play and have some tea.
I'm doing the one skydive, but if I was doing it more often, I think I would actually have to consider Thomas, my son, more, because obviously it's a bigger risk. Once you maybe get away with it, but if you're doing it every week or every month, it might be a different matter.
I think becoming a parent makes you much more aware of the risks that there are in life. Quite clearly, you will be very risk-averse as far as your child is concerned. And indeed, you may be more risk-averse as far as you are concerned. Yep. When my children were young, I used to cycle to work in London, but after a while I decided that this was too dangerous. My children needed their father, so I stopped cycling to work. It had changed my attitude to the risk I could take. Probably not influenced by attitude to what I thought the probability of an accident occurring was, but raised my awareness of the impact of an accident, the consequence, the outcome, should one occur.
Boy, boy.
Lovely. Very good. Excellent.
Down in Sussex, Susan is facing a decision that every parent needs to think about in the first few weeks of their baby's life, whether or not to have Gina immunised against diseases such as whooping cough and polio. However, Susan and her husband Peter didn't have to make this choice with their first child, Thomas, as he was born with a serious heart condition and wasn't strong enough to be immunised until he was older. He's now a bouncing 3-year-old. For some parents, the early vaccinations are a cause of great anxiety, because in very extreme cases, some vaccines have been linked to side effects as severe as convulsions and cot death. But Susan and Peter think that the benefits are clear.
We felt that it's more important to have our kid immunised because of the effect that it will have on the community. So we want to sort of make sure that the resistance in the community against these diseases are high.
Our first child couldn't have the immunisations because he had a heart problem. So he could have caught it from other people if they hadn't been immunised.
When you get to a certain level of people being immune to a disease, whether that's through immunisation or having had the disease themselves, you get to a situation where even if someone is not immune, there is not enough of the disease around for them to run a risk of catching it. So, for example, if 95, 98% of people were immune to measles, the 1 or 2% of people who weren't immune would be protected indirectly by those who had become immunised.
She's coming for her full set of immunisations, which is tetanus, polio
and hepatitis B.
Did you look at all into the side effects of any of those early immunisations?
No, I didn't. No. Obviously, I read the books that were given to us, but I didn't do any other research on it.
Did you do any research into the side effects of any of the early immunisations?
Not these ones, no. No, I feel confident that these have gone on for long enough to be to have had sufficient research, I hope.
Okay, so just to remind you about what she has, it's the same as last time. She has polio by mouth, and then she has the combined injection, which is diphtheria, tetanus, the whooping cough, and Hib, which is the Hib meningitis.
That's right.
And then in the other leg, she has meningitis C. All right?
Okay. Doesn't know what's coming, does she?
No, we have to give her this one by mouth. Good, good. Let's see what she thinks of this. It tastes very nice, I'm afraid. Oh, so they tend to make a fuss about it. If you just feed her, then she'll help it to go down. Nice taste now. Good.
Good girl. Is this one of the ones we've got to watch out for poo? Because I have heard about people catching polio from the children after they've been vaccinated.
Yes, it's a very slight risk, but it has been recorded. So you have to be very careful about hand washing at the time of changing nappies, as you would anyway. But just remember that for a few weeks after the immunisation, there is a slight risk of that.
Okay.
Is it the case that 1 in a million children will develop polio from the vaccine?
That's the rough risk, yes, and it's highest with the first dose and is much less with the subsequent doses.
So why should parents run that risk when polio's almost been eradicated in the world?
Because in terms of continuing that process to eradicate it is probably the most effective way of doing it. It's not a question of taking a risk or not taking a risk, and what they have to do is balance the risk. And unfortunately, we know from recent experience in the Netherlands and in Dublin that diseases that people look upon as normal childhood experiences, like measles, still kill children.
Good girl. Good girl.
Oh, was that nasty?
She's realised what's happened.
When it's an immunisation, you are taking a decision for your child. And I know a lot of parents feel that they would prefer, in a sense, not to take the decision. So they say, well, I'll not have my child immunised, with an underlying feeling that if they had had their child immunised and something happened, it would have been their fault. Whereas if the child is not immunised and catches a disease, that's bad luck, it's an act of God. Now, of course, logically, there's no difference between the two, but logic isn't everything. Emotion plays a large part when it comes to your own child.
I think parents find it difficult sometimes, at least, to hand over decisions to an authority about, for example, health of their children, because I think they feel that the authority isn't especially concerned with that individual child, and to some extent that's right. The authority's got to think about all children and future children, so that in some sense they feel that they are handing over the decision to someone who's depersonalising their child, no longer treating them as an individual.
Thank you.
Susan and Peter have decided that in their case, the views of the authority match what is best for their child. Meanwhile, Sarah has taken the decision for herself to have another shot at jumping.
Sarah, how are you feeling?
Fine. Rested, raring to go.
It's a bit windy. It's depressing because we might not get to jump, but it might pick up.
I won't call myself a risk taker, am I?
It's not a risk taker. I've got 2 young children. I don't take big risks. They're all educated risks. But somebody said to me, aren't you scared of the plane going wrong? Aren't you scared of the parachute not opening? I just think if that happens, we were far more, especially with Hazel driving, we were far more likely to die on the way here than we ever were jumping out of a plane. I mean, it's a safer thing as you're going to ever get if you want to enjoy yourself, don't you? Yeah, it's the fear, not the risk, isn't it?
You've got a day job as well.
People who take part in extreme sports are probably aware of the risks involved. But for them, the enjoyment and thrill they get far outweighs the risks.
Do you know when you need the jump?
For the rest of us, we're also weighing up possible benefits when we're making decisions in everyday life, and this concept is known as utility.
OK, folks, that boring you to tears and going through the TAF. A TAF is an accurate weather forecast, which we just received from Stansted. It's giving us broken cloud at 400 feet, rain, showers and drizzle is what's forecast for the remainder of the day. Guess what we're not going to be doing today? Sorry about that, folks. OK, folks, thanks for your attention.
Never mind.
You're going to be back next week.
Sorry, not doing it. Going on. Wasted journey.
I've had a can of Coke and some minstrels, I'm fine.
So the weather's made up Sarah's mind for her at the moment. Here in Lewes, in East Sussex, extraordinary weather in October 2000 brought a series of decisions about risk right to people's doorsteps.
Average rainfall for a month fell in a day, and this was the result. Parts of Lewes are completely immersed. Rescue workers say it's amazing everyone escaped, as waters here rose rapidly to heights not seen in living memory. The streets are now canals, cars, homes and businesses deserted. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News.
Gina's mother, Susan, co-owns Application Solutions, an electronics company situated on the banks of the River Ouse in Lewes. As the river swelled to dangerous heights on the 12th of October 2000, Susan and her staff, including her husband Peter, found the waters rising around them. I went to meet Peter Midgley, the Environment Agency officer responsible for the flood defences in East Sussex, to ask him how much warning they'd had of the flood.
What we have in here is the equipment that we use to sort of control any major incident, be it a flood or a pollution. If you want to sit down, we can have a look. We've got the master map that we use to illustrate the floodplain areas.
So all the places marked in turquoise are liable to flooding?
That's it, yeah. The turquoise areas are liable to flooding either from the sea, but also further up the valleys. The smaller blue sections are the areas of river channel where the river can overtop and flow out onto the floodplain and cause havoc and mayhem as it sort of comes down towards the sea. This shows the actual severe flood warning, which was sent out when we were really sure that the whole of the centre of Lewes was going to become flooded as a result of that excessive rainfall.
We had faxes from Environmental Agency warning us of a serious flood, and but it was really difficult to believe that. And I actually had a £500 bet with my business partner that the flood impact won't be too bad.
What we've got on here is the data from October 2000 when we had the flooding in Lewes. The little blocks down here at the bottom are 15-minute values of rainfall. Then this red line actually shows the river level as measured right in the centre of Lewes. But as soon as the rainfall begins in earnest, then the river level begins to rise and rise until we get this very wet period on the 11th, 12th of October, and the river just shoots upwards until it reaches this point where it overtopped the defences, pushed the defences aside and flooded the whole of the floodplain in the centre of Lewes.
The full horror of that flood damage greeted Susan on her return to the building the next day.
But what I saw was water everywhere. You know, in some areas water was above the desk level, so our computers that we managed to put over the desk, or equipment and files and documents were damaged, and everything else. It was a total disaster, absolute write-off.
But things went from bad to worse for Susan when one of her insurance companies, Independent Insurance, went bust 8 months later. This left her without flood insurance coverage for either business interruption or contents.
We had a week to find a company who actually wanted to insure us, and we managed to get Norwich Union to insure us, but we have been unable to get the insurance for flood.
Susan would like eventually to move her company to larger premises, but not having this flood insurance makes it difficult for her to sell her building.
Insurance is a method of transferring my risk to you. my risk to somebody else who's willing to take that risk in my place. Now I have to pay a price for that.
Peter Bernstein is the author of Against the Gods, a book which explores the different ways in which we've attempted over the centuries to cope with the unpredictable and risky nature of life.
But the essential nature is that an insurance company is a collector of money from a lot of different people. They try to diversify this risk and then pays it out to the people who have losses. Insurance companies, in a way, are like gambling casinos. When you go to the roulette wheel and bet on 13, you're betting that 13 comes up. You're betting against the casino. When you take out life insurance, you're betting with the insurance company that you're going to die before your time, because that way your family will make money. If you live longer, you're going to be paying out more money than your family gets back. So you're making a bet against the insurance company, just the same way that when you go to the roulette wheel, you're making a bet against the casino. And it may work, may not work. On the average, insurance companies make money and casinos make money.
But it's not always as straightforward as this. What happens when the odds on something happening lengthen to the degree of the Lewis flood? It was said that this was a once-in-200-year occurrence, but some question how this was calculated and what it really means.
It was a very rare event. Certainly our records of the river flows, the river levels, go back almost 200 years. This was by far the worst event we've ever recorded over that time. The biggest flood we've ever seen down here in the valley.
How do you calculate the probability of a flood like that happening?
In any one given year, there's a 200 to 1 against chance of that sort of flood happening. So it's a very severe, a very rare weather event which came together and flooded the whole of the town centre.
It's absolute rubbish and nonsense. You only need to open your eyes and see what's happening around the world. And first of all, we had at least 2 serious floods last year in 1 year. Secondly, with global warming, the seasons are not so clear-cut anymore, and this is not once every 200 or 100 or even 40-year event. We expect it to flood again. But it's going to be this year, next year, or 3 or 4 years' time. But it will happen a lot more frequently than the environmental agency is claiming.
There's a recency, an immediacy effect. If something's just occurred, then we think it's more likely to occur again. So, for example, when there's been some sort of catastrophe, like a plane crash or something, everybody's awareness of this sort of event is heightened. So they artificially inflate the probability that that will happen. They think it's much more likely to happen than it actually does.
But perhaps the floods really are becoming more common. Statisticians have known for centuries that it's important to keep records up to date.
A Protestant minister in the early 1800s named Thomas Bayes developed the notion that we can change the probabilities as we go along as new information becomes available. You change the formula in which you calculate the probability by putting the new information in along with the probability of the old. It's a dynamic process. Much more realistic and a very exciting way to develop these ideas.
But all your calculations are based on history. What about the impact of global warming?
Certainly at the moment we are basing it on past history. We've looked at the river levels, the rainfall in the past. If climate change does mean that rainfalls change, then yes, that risk could change.
Here comes the weather with Ivor. Thanks very much indeed. It should become somewhat drier and brighter. We'll see some sunny intervals developing, and the winds from the southwest beginning to freshen up a little bit. Temperatures very respectable, 18 or 19 at best. The low from the evening.
Hi Sarah, how are you feeling?
Hiya.
All right?
Yes, I think so.
Looking forward to this?
Yes.
Good. I hope you enjoy it.
A week has passed since Sarah's last attempt to jump, and the weather has finally come up trumps for her. But will the sunshine hold out? And will her resolve melt away before she has a chance to see the jump through?
There we are.
Right, let's sort you out with an altimeter. Right, here's your hat, the radio's in. There we go. Just like to make your way to the flight line. And we'll see you there in 2 seconds and check you out.
go, Sarah. The #1 jumper. You know you want
Who's
to.
number 2 to push me out if I don't go?
And I'm dead keen.
Nervous. The excitement will probably kick in a bit later on, and then the terror. But no, I'm all right at the minute.
Luck be a lady tonight. Luck be a lady tonight. Luck if you've ever been a lady to begin with. Luck be a lady tonight. Luck let a gentleman see how nice a dame you can be. I know the way you've treated other guys you've been with. Luck be a lady with me.
As the plane reaches 3,500 feet, it's crunch time for Sarah. We might not put ourselves in quite this position, but the process by which she's reached her decision is the same for all of us.
We spend a lot of time when we think about the future talking about probabilities. But the greatest mistakes we make, I think, are coloring things too much by hope or not being willing to consider the consequences. That you must think of what is the value of this outcome to me? Is it more important that I win, which would be nice, or catastrophic to me if I lose? And that almost every decision we make in life has to be put through that filter.
Sarah's really thought this through. She's not making her decision in the heat of the moment. But even if you've weighed up all the risks and thought through all the consequences in your best rational manner, it ultimately comes down to making that decision or taking that leap yourself.
Let's keep the party polite. Never get out of my sight. Stick with me, baby, I'm the fella you came in with. Luck be a lady. Luck be a lady. Luck be a lady.
It was a rubbish landing. It was an absolute rubbish landing. How was it? Fantastic.
This is the story of the numbers that rule our lives, performance indicators. They're already invading almost every public institution, and it's just the beginning. Every autumn, one particular group of people wait avidly for the school exam results.
Because people know that school and they know that it is a very popular school.
What time can you say us?
If a school in their area does especially well, their commission will go up.
I mean, it's one of those schools that's got very good reports from its exam results, isn't it?
Estate agents know that when a school comes near the top of the exam league tables, the demand from parents for houses nearby will rocket. Parents have always used a variety of information to come up with a hunch about the best school for their child. Local anecdotes about its reputation. Perhaps it was simply the nearest. Maybe they liked the science labs. But now, more often than not, it's a decision strongly influenced by just one performance indicator, the school's exam results. And a couple of points difference in a school's result can add thousands of pounds to the price of a house. There are half a dozen families who want to buy these houses. That's because they're in the catchment area of Mill Hill County High, a comprehensive school with impressive performance indicators. 77% of Mill Hill children get 5 or more A to C grades at GCSE, almost 30% higher than the national average. And that's worth hard cash, £30,000 to be precise, the extra these houses sell for by being safely inside the catchment area. According to government figures, 1 in 2 parents now use the exam league tables to help them decide about schools. But are they right to? What does a performance indicator really tell you about the quality of a school? Every weekday afternoon, Carol Wells joins other parents at St Michael's School in Highgate, North London, to pick up her 11-year-old son, Darren, and often a friend or two as well.
Hello. Hi, Edward. Hello. You all right? You ready to go home?
Yeah.
It's a routine she's got used to, but not for much longer. Darren's in his last year at junior school, and Carol needs to decide which secondary school would suit him best.
Darren's a typical little boy. He likes sports and he likes all sorts of things, but he's actually quite bright. I want one, obviously, that he's going to get a good education. I think that's very important now for children to have a good education. But again, he will have to have lots of outside interests. So I want a school that's got good sports program, drama, whatever. It's something that's going to keep him occupied. He's not going to get bored, because when Darren gets bored, that's when problems start.
But Carol's problems have started already. Darren wants a school full of activity, but Carol wants other things as well. And as a single mother making the decision on her own, she's been searching for some kind of objective information to help her not slip up.
I've been looking at league tables. I've actually looked at the Times, the Telegraph, when they print out league tables from the previous year. I've got local boroughs. They have actually lists of their schools and how they perform. Yeah, it's quite a stressful exercise, really.
Carol's noticed that the official performance indicators only measure certain things, like exam results, and leave out others she considers just as important.
Well, Mill Hill looks very interesting. I've just been looking at this, and obviously I'm interested in the GCSEs, and they've got 77% at A to C, which is very good. But they don't seem to tell you anything about any sport they have, any extracurricular activities. That's a bit worrying, but according to the statistics, it's gone right up again. Beats Barnet, the Lead Borough, and it's way ahead of the national one in England. So I'm quite impressed by that.
Impressed enough to request a tour around the school from the man who should be able to answer all her questions. When Alan Davison drops into a lesson, he simply can't resist giving a hand. He's that kind of head.
So, ladies and gents, put your hands up. Mr. Stowe's just told me that money's not worth anything. No. How many of you agree with him?
Oh, come on, he teaches us history.
That's a good answer. We teach French, German and Latin.
But the more difficult question is, do the school's impressive performance indicators really reflect the quality of the teaching?
Excusez-moi, Monsieur Benjamin.
The first problem is that exam league tables mix up how well children are taught with the ability of the children who went to the school in the first place. Mill Hill County High does very well, but with their kind of eager, well-motivated students, which school wouldn't?
So very interesting.
Yeah, I like playing on my computer at home.
That's
I think in looking at any school, one of the things you need to look at is the real strengths of the school.
The second problem is that it's pretty easy for schools to put on a performance of their own. It's possible to manipulate the results by getting rid of poorly performing children. Or they can try to put most of their energy into grade D students and boost their results at the expense of the rest.
Which school she might like to send her son to.
These techniques statisticians call gaming, and it's hardly surprising that they happen when how a school performs affects salaries, promotions, even how much money the school gets.
Okay? You gesture-wise, you can vote yes.
The difficulty for parents is knowing which schools are manipulating the results in this way and which aren't. It's not the kind of question most parents can really ask teachers. But then Carol isn't like most parents. She's currently doing a course in statistics as part of a business degree, and she wants to know if Mill Hill County plays any statistical games.
We focus on raising the achievement of all students. In fact, just focusing on the Ds, if we did it, would very much be an opportunity to raise all students' achievement. There isn't, as far as I know, any process which only raises one group of students' achievement. You target all students, you do the best you can.
But they have a head start, don't they? With their intake, surely they're bound to do well.
I think if you look at the more detailed value-added information, then you can find out how schools are performing in terms of what they're doing for individual students and how they're doing with groups of students in various subjects. And that has a great deal more to offer.
Value added. Instead of a snapshot of one exam result, they measure how much a school has added to a child's performance year on year from when they get them at 11 to when they leave at 16 or 18. Value-added league tables is now the mantra of teachers and educationalists. This performance indicator, they say, really tells you something. It will show how well a school's helping children to improve, whether or not they were very able in the first place. Or will it? Not according to this man, who spent the last decade studying the statistical problems of league tables. Professor Harvey Goldstein thinks the value-added tables are a little better, but still don't entirely help us compare like with like.
When you're dealing with real schools, and this is particularly true in the case of primary schools, but also in the case of secondary schools, you simply don't have enough numbers of children to make precise enough comparisons.
Although school results are shown as a single figure in a table, they're nowhere near that certain. All we can say is that the true numbers lie somewhere within a range. The uncertainty is because there are many chance factors that could be affecting the result, like sickness on exam day, or simply the possibility that the school has, by chance, got some untypically good or bad students this year. As Professor Goldstein showed me, when you compare the more statistically valid ranges instead of the numbers, it becomes much more difficult to tell most schools apart, because their ranges overlap, often quite considerably.
And what you can see is that for this school and for this school, we can say something reasonably sensible, that they differ, this one being above the national average and that below the national average. But for the other 4 out of 6, the evidence, the statistical evidence, is not there that these can really be distinguished from the national average or indeed from each other. It's what we statisticians call sampling variability. When you take that into account, you find that for most of the comparisons you want to make, you cannot distinguish between schools.
Professor Goldstein has calculated that to allow for chance factors and narrow the range of results down sufficiently to be able to make really clear comparisons between most schools, the schools would need over 6,000 pupils each. And there's no school in Britain anywhere near that big.
I think they are misleading. They don't tell you what's actually going on in the school. They largely reflect intake achievement, and I think if parents want to use them to judge the quality of education, they can be very seriously misled.
Which is reassuring news for Carol Wells. Despite giving him a hard time, she couldn't help admiring Alan Davison and his school, but not quite enough to pay the extra 30 grand to buy a house in the catchment area.
He's very, very pleasant, but he was a bit overpowering. He has done wonders with the school. According to the league tables, it's gone up so much in the past few years that it's very impressive. It can be a bit suspect when it goes up that fast. I didn't think that the league table showed me very much about the school. I was more impressed with having visited the school because you got a better feel what they're learning. I saw them in the class. I saw how they were taught. But if it comes to my son, I think he'd actually do better at an old boys' school. There's far too many girls for Darren.
So school league tables, the most well-known performance indicator, seem to be of limited use to Carol. But you can't say that about others, according to the organisation that's one of the powerhouses of performance indicators in Britain. At the Audit Commission in Westminster are some of Britain's most passionate defenders of these vital statistics. They say that Britain's performance indicators and the targets that have been set as a result have made it possible for the first time to measure and improve services. 15% more pedestrian crossings with facilities for the disabled, fewer streetlights not working, more highways reaching an acceptable level of cleanliness. Without performance indicators, this would never have happened.
The public has a right to know. They pay for it through taxes, their lives often depend upon it. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to be measuring what is going on. And if that shows that some parts of the service are underperforming, then clearly you need to do something in order to raise that performance.
The question is what? Unlike private industry, where performance indicators were first developed, you can hardly let a local council, hospital, fire service or police force go bust. And giving a large bonus for good results may well, as we saw with schools, simply be rewarding those with a good starting point or who benefit from pure chance. There are other problems for Peter Wilkinson and his team as well. They can work out definitions pretty precisely amongst themselves, but they're dependent on other people on the ground actually collecting the information.
So there is a slight possibility with this one that the data won't really be perfect in some areas.
In fact, the data in some areas can be very suspect, making the indicator useless. And sometimes it's complete rubbish, literally speaking, that is.
One of the very many performance indicators for local government is to do with the number of rubbish collections missed per 100,000 collections. And there's an enormous range on that. Even within London, the borough of Waltham Forest had 6,917 rubbish collections missed per 100,000, whereas Camden only had 21. Enormous difference between those figures, an enormous range, and there are lots of questions you can ask about this. 6,917, it does sound, well, it's a big number, but it's also awfully precise. I mean, 6,917, you know, how did they know?
Or indeed know about Camden's 21. And since Camden's my local borough, I have a very personal interest in this. I thought I'd find out why their performance indicators are so good.
Well, very conscientious workers. Any rubbish, take it all away, no messing about. It's the thing to do.
But I mean, it must be quite easy just to miss the odd one.
Well, mistakes do happen now and again, obviously, you know. I mean, we're only human. But we do the best that we can. But like I say, mistakes do happen now and again, you know.
But mistakes seem to happen less in Camden than elsewhere.
Well, I think you've got the best workers in Camden, that's why. Yeah, we're a bunch of lads, you know, get stuck in, get the job done, that's it. Try to do the best we can. That's all we can do. That's what I tell people. We're going to do the best we can. No more than that, you know.
That's what you tell me at Christmas. And what happens, though, if you start to perform badly?
We have the supervisor on, and that's all, or we get threatened with the sack.
There's little doubt that performance indicators have contributed to the men's desire to do a good job. But how much that would have happened anyway is difficult to say. Wages are the highest they've ever been. What the statistics have done in Camden is encourage a scrupulous concern that the missed collection figures are not any higher than they should be.
If there is a collection that's been missed, I will go investigate that address. And we find 9 times out of 10 it is normally recycle problem, or it could be garden waste, which doesn't come under domestic waste. We then get that rectification cancelled.
Ah, that's why it's so low. And I thought counting a missed collection was just noting down a dustbin that hadn't been emptied.
You've got to say what you mean by a missed collection, by a bin not being emptied. And the Audit Commission have done that. They've got a definition that takes several lines of writing to write out. It's a missed collection if a resident has told the council that the bin wasn't emptied. It's also a missed collection if it's a collection which is known by the authority not to have taken place on the prescribed day due to a failure of the authority or its contractor, including those missed due to weather conditions or industrial action. And we're not finished yet.
Indeed, we're not. There are several other definitions, including one of exactly what constitutes writing to the resident. All these definitions end up in a precise formula that every council is required to apply. X, the number of missed collections, including recycling box collections, over Y times Z, where Y is the number of properties in an area, and Z the number of times the bins should have been collected, all multiplied by 100,000 to give the same baseline for each council.
We've ended up with half a page of definition and not utterly straightforward formula, and some poor council officer, or several of them in each council, having to worry about how to measure all these things. And we end up with the possibility that actually they're not all quite doing it the same way, and that differences between councils might really be due to some slight difference in the way they've measured these figures, rather than there really being something wrong in one of them with the way the bin men are working.
And that applies all across the board. The information used to determine at least some performance indicators has often been questioned and occasionally shown to be garbage.
How confident are you, though, of the accuracy of the data? I mean, to calculate a missing collection, a council has to apply a pretty complicated formula.
Actually, the formula looks complicated, but for the sort of people in councils that are dealing with this every day, it's something they get very used to. Ultimately, also, we're an external audit body. We also have external auditors, so there's always a chance we'll come down and check it ourselves.
A threat many local services now take very seriously. There's little doubt that local government workers feel increasingly under surveillance from the new performance culture, as do other professionals.
My belief is that it is not simply affecting police work, it's actually perverting it.
Professor Cashmore was invited to conduct confidential, in-depth interviews with 100 black and Asian police officers in the Midlands and East Anglia. The officers told him that the introduction of performance indicator targets in almost every aspect of their jobs has put them under pressure to do things they judged unnecessary.
Time and again, the story would come back to me, tales of how they felt under pressure to produce the numbers, to hit the targets, to get the requisite figures of, might be arrests, it could be stops, searches, intelligence gathering, even something as simple as stopping a motorist and asking that motorist to present his or her documents at the nearest police station. That's a recordable activity. It's a number.
But that's not all. Professor Cashmore's research threw up a quite unexpected and disturbing consequence of the performance indicator culture that now controls much police activity. The targets encouraged many police officers to concentrate on stopping black and Asian young men because they thought this might increase their number of arrests.
One Asian officer put it to me, and I paraphrase him, I've got colleagues who subscribe to the philosophy that if there's a car with 4 black youths in it, it's worth giving it a pull because at least 2 of them are up to no good. And of course what we have here is racial profiling. It's an unwitting consequence of this kind of performance culture that we have.
So performance indicators can actually produce outcomes that weren't intended when they were set up. But do their benefits outweigh these drawbacks?
So would you say that today we are living in a performance indicator culture?
I would say that today we're getting a lot more information about performance, and I personally would think that is a good thing.
But others disagree. A mile away from the Audit Commission is the alternative, the New Economics Foundation. It's another world. Even their director doesn't have his own office, but sits with everyone else. The most popular part is the chill-out area. No, it's definitely not a place where official performance indicators seem to go down all that well. In fact, one of their key staff goes a lot further.
The kind of society we have with too many indicators is one that never asks fundamental questions, that never uses its imagination, that never steps beyond the confines of the institutions that we have already, and that in the end begins to feel nervous of using its common sense and relying on its own judgment. A very centralized society. And I think we have to be very scared of that.
But David Boyle doesn't deny that measuring can be useful, so the Foundation has been championing another kind of indicator that comes not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Indicators that people feel excited by, that grip the imagination.
An example of how it might be done differently is in Seattle, where the whole population was consulted over a 2-year period about how they should measure success. And as a result now, Seattle measures its success according to how many salmon are in the streams, how many books are taken out of the libraries, how many books are bought, the ratio of vegetarian restaurants to the number of McDonald's. And though you may not say these are important, but they obviously are important to the people of Seattle.
The idea is to devise different ways of measuring the quality of life, and it's catching on. Community groups in Peterborough have opted to count the cars that only have one occupant. In Hertfordshire, the street's quiet enough to hold a conversation, and in Norwich, the number of swans. All 3 indicators and you've got paradise, in this case Lindfield in Sussex.
All this is quite fun. It can give some people ideas about the kind of places they want to live in. I favour Seattle over Norwich, but then I value a good cup of coffee more than a swan or 2. But for some people, making choices based on performance indicators is a much more serious business.
Now he's coming up from his nursery and now he bowls, and Inzamam is on the back foot watching the
In Bradford Abbas, near Sherborne in Dorset, one cricket fan is not really enjoying Test Match Special. It's all very well relaxing when you want to. When you can't do anything else, it's a real pain, as Chris Borsch has found out over the last 6 months.
I had the x-rays and then when they looked at them they said, my God, you have a pretty mushy hip.
Well, it's affected our lives, really, both of us. I mean, I walk the dogs now. Christopher can't walk the dogs. I do most of the gardening. I do all the mowing. Most of the gardening. It's affected us. We can't really go away anywhere because we can't do anything when we get there.
Terribly frustrating. Frustration, I think, is the worst thing. You can put up with pain, just basically, but it's the frustration. It doesn't matter if it hurts you to get over something. When you physically can't do it, then you get frustrated, and that's the worst pain of all, frustration. We know that us older folks tend to suffer more frustration as the years go on, and you can't have Viagra for everything, can you?
What Chris needs is not Viagra, but a hip replacement. The operation itself is routine, but as with any operation, there are risks. People die on the operating table. Chris would rather not be one of them. His GP, Simon Cave, wouldn't like him to pop off either.
Have a bit. All right. Okay, just bend. Say when it starts.
Christopher could go to his nearest hospital in Yeovil, but Dr. Cave thinks he would do better in Dorset County Hospital in Dorchester, and he's got the statistics to prove it. They've come not from the official health service indicators on the web, but from Dr. Foster, an alternative site which uses official statistics to calculate a performance indicator that every patient would like to know, especially those about to go into hospital, the mortality index.
12% less than you'd expect for the types of patients within that. But there is a difference between your two major choices between here and here.
Yeovil Hospital Trust's mortality index is a lot worse than Dorset County's. According to the statistical model the website uses, 260 more people die every year there than you'd expect. In Dorset County, there are 320 fewer deaths, which makes the choice between the hospitals relatively straightforward, if the statistics are right. That they are is the responsibility of this man, Professor Brian Jarman. He did the calculations, and it's his reputation that's on the line if the figures are wrong.
I was interested in it, really, I suppose, as a GP, because people would come to me and say, well, I want to have a coronary artery bypass graft, CABG, as we call it in medicine, and where do you recommend that I should go? And I didn't have the information, and I could see that for that patient, it was very important. And it would be very important for me if I were having a CABG as well. I'd like to know. The variation, I believe, in units in this country is from something like, as far as I know, about 0.5% to 20%.
In other words, you have a much greater chance of dying in some hospitals than others. How much greater is shown by the new index.
So this is 21% less.
So the Royal Free is one of the best. Show me one of the worst.
Well, let's say there's one in West Bromwich here, Sandwell.
It turns out that my local hospital in Leafy Hampstead does much better than Sandwell Hospital. But isn't that what you would expect? Most people living in the Black Country are less well off, and probably not in as good health as the people living in London NW3.
The average for England, which is 100 by definition.
Surely the mortality index is as flawed a performance indicator as the school exam results. Not according to the professor.
You've got to start saying, well, this particular hospital has a lot of elderly people. So we have to adjust for the fact that there are more elderly. So you have the adjusted for elderly, and then you say, well, there are more females in central London, which there are. You've got to adjust for that, and so on. And so you have to adjust for age and sex. And then if a patient goes to hospital as an emergency, they're much more likely to die because 93% of all deaths occur in the emergencies, only 60% of the admissions emergencies. So hospitals that have got a high proportion of emergencies are going to have more deaths. And if you don't allow for that, then you're not really comparing the hospitals in a fair way.
Sir Brian argues that their index has taken into account all the possible confounding factors, although some statisticians and health experts are not convinced. He also says the data used is pretty accurate and that hospitals find it difficult to manipulate the figures. A death is a death is a death. But could the variation be down to pure chance? What about uncertainty? Are the confidence intervals around each index narrow enough for us to be sure we can tell one hospital's performance from another? Because that's the real problem with school league tables, isn't it?
That's a good question. The thing is that because we're dealing with millions of admissions, the accuracy with which we can measure the level of death adjusted is very high.
And that's really one of the great strengths of the way we've actually done it. And if you were to actually bring the death rate from the highest death rate hospitals to the lowest, it would probably be around 50,000 a year difference.
Which is a sobering thought, a performance indicator that could actually save lives. It was this that mattered to Chris and Geraldine Bolsh. With the help of the Dr. Foster Mortality Index, they opted for Dorset County Hospital for Chris's operation, not Chris's local hospital in Yeovil.
So what have we learnt about performance indicators, these vital statistics that are influencing so many aspects of our lives?
Well, some are better than others. We need to ask how far they're influenced by pure chance. Are they being manipulated? Will the very fact of setting targets actually produce a perverse effect which was never intended? And crucially, was the data accurate in the first place? That said, they can be useful policy tools, and they can give us information to help us make decisions about our lives. They just can't make the decisions for us.
In the end, performance indicators are like any other numbers based on people. They aren't perfect. We need to realize what they measure and what they don't, and how well they do it. And we don't have any choice in this, because these statistics are going to be dominating our lives into the foreseeable future. As for me, I'm off to Seattle. Number of vegetarian restaurants, 10. Scientists are on the verge of understanding the human genome, the complete genetic map for a human being. During the last century, one human being in particular helped pave the way.
Fisher is the greatest of them all. He's the number one. You can't really think of anybody who's more important in the history of statistics.
There's a general rule in biology that if you have a bright idea, then there's 9/10 of a chance it's in Darwin. But if it isn't, then there's 9/10 of a chance that it's in Fisher.
The whole of modern research in agriculture, in medicine, and to a large extent in industry as well, is based on the principles which Fisher laid down.
Even someone as far-sighted as Ronald Aylmer Fisher might have been surprised by his legacy. Yet today, few people beyond the scientific community have heard of him. Joan Box has devoted much of her life to the quest to uncover more about Fisher.
R.A. Fisher, yes, he was my father. I was the closest of the family to him, and I felt I wanted to collect anything that was known of him and keep it, to preserve it.
Now living in the United States, Joan has returned to Britain on a journey into the past.
I should imagine the first impression people would have would be of an untidy person, scruffy looking, an untidy beard, strong glasses. Really, he couldn't see very well at all, and in his late years was practically blind. But he had more important things to do than worry about his appearance.
On the outskirts of Harpenden is the world's longest-running centre for agricultural research. It was here, at Rothamsted, that as a statistician, Fisher was at his most creative.
We only have a small herd of cattle now.
Oh, is that right? So you keep them just for
farmyard manure, that's it, yeah. You'll remember the manor house, of course.
150 years ago, its founder, Sir John Laws, believed he could make his fortune by investing in a new discovery, artificial fertilizers. He needed the money for the upkeep of the manor house, the Laws' ancestral home dating from the 17th century.
Anxious to secure his investment, he began a series of fertilizer experiments. Laws divided some of his fields into strips, each one using a different treatment. Rothamsted became particularly important when the First World War increased the need to improve British food production. Fisher became chief statistician here in 1919.
So here we are, Joan, at Broadbalk.
Broadbalk it is. It's a long time since I saw it.
Uh-huh. Well, it's been in winter wheat since 1843.
Wheat has been grown on Broadbalk Field for over 150 years, using a variety of fertilizers.
So we'll go and have a look at the section that has never had any weed killer. We put 2 or 3 herbicides on this area during the year.
The results have been monitored continuously, and Fisher's first challenge was to re-examine the mass of accumulated data, raking over the muck heap, as he later described it.
35 tons of farmyard manure every year goes on here.
That's splendid.
Yeah.
But in terms of the numbers required for reliable statistics, even this mass of data didn't amount to much. Fisher was, nevertheless, able to devise groundbreaking ways of working with it.
Fisher's time at Rothamsted was fundamental to the growth of statistics as we know it today. Statistics grew up in this country, if you like, in the early 1900s under Carl Pearson. Pearson liked to deal with large numbers. This simply doesn't happen. You have an experiment on the farm at Rothamsted which might have 32 field plots, and you've got to make the most of it. And this is what Fisher did in his pioneering work in the 20s. He developed the methodology which we all use today for extracting the information from a limited amount of material. And to do this, he had to reinvent the discipline of statistics.
He did this by emphasizing the importance of involving the statistician right at the start of an experiment, and devised methods for designing experiments which are still widely used today.
Fisher once said that if you called a statistician in at the end of an experiment, he could perform a post-mortem. He could tell you what the experiment died of. And what he really showed was that you had to call statisticians in at the beginning if you wanted to get the most out of your data.
The winter wheat experiment will discover the fertility of different types of wheat treated with different amounts of fertilizer. But it must also take into account additional factors, such as the levels of fertility in different parts of the field. Fisher pioneered ways of working across a range of factors and exploring how they influence each other.
Often nature won't reveal her secrets if we vary factors one at a time. We often have to vary them together, but in a plan which has been carefully chosen.
The modern design of winter wheat, based on Fisher's ideas, incorporates numerous blocks accounting for different combinations of background factors.
Fisher was always the sort of personality who liked measurement, who liked certainty, but who appreciated the fact, because he worked in a biological environment like Rothamsted, that there is no such thing as certainty in scientific research. And this, I think, was what drove Fisher psychologically, if you like, the quest for certainty in the presence of uncertainty.
Fisher, like all scientists, was driven by the quest for certainty. He was faced with variable experiments all his life, and he showed that that didn't provide the scientist with a reason for despair. He could, in fact, marshal the data. He could deal with variability in such a way that nevertheless, at the end, reasonably certain conclusions would be reached.
He was determined to understand the unpredictability of nature, to measure the unmeasurable.
It was well known that the fertility of plots could vary from plot to plot, and so methods had to be found of taking account of this. What Fisher showed was that you also had to carry this through to the analysis.
Nowadays, researchers analyze the data with computers, using methods Fisher himself invented at Rothamsted. An instant analysis of variance can be produced, displaying the interaction between the varieties of wheat and fertilizer in a style very similar to Fisher's own.
And I remember very well my excitement as a student when I first saw one of these electrical machines doing division all by itself. You press the button, it whirred backwards and forwards, and out came the answer. The millionaire computer was Fisher's own purchase. When he was appointed here in 1919, he shocked the director by saying, "What I must have is a calculating machine." Such a thing had never been heard of.
At Rothamsted, the search for certainty enabled British farmers to maximize their productivity, and Fisher's methods were swiftly adopted worldwide. Fisher thought of himself not as a statistician, but as a scientist, and in 1929 he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in recognition of his achievements at Rothamsted.
He was someone who was fascinated by biology from a very early stage of his life, but he also was a very good mathematician. And somehow he realized that he could apply his mathematical insight to biological problems. And this was something which really opened a whole new world for him.
Rothamsted could more easily accommodate Fisher's new world than a university might have done. It also gave him time and space to develop his own research into genetics. But he brought his obsession home with him.
He started breeding mice at home, and the eye colours and coat colours grew more and more numerous, and the mice grew more and more numerous.
After 14 years at Rothamsted, Fisher finally began an academic career in genetics, and the mice went with him. From a professorship at University College London, he went on to teach at Cambridge.
Yes, he led a double life from the beginning. It was both genetics and statistics. There was never any cessation.
Anthony Edwards is a Fellow of Caius, Fisher's College, and was his last undergraduate student.
I'd heard this name, but I could see no reason why this famous statistician should be teaching genetics. And in any case, I thought he must have been a contemporary of Isaac Newton's. It hadn't occurred to me that this man might still be alive. I just turned up on spec, as it were, in the afternoon, and when I went through the open door of the Department of Genetics to ask for the person whom I'd been told to go and see, I thought he was the hall porter.
His appearance held clues to the roots of his genius.
He was a short man, a wiry, tough man, bearded, pipe smoker. He had very short sight and had always had very short sight, and one of the things I keep in my room in college was his last pair of spectacles, and I thought you might like to see how very, very small and how the glass is very thick at the edges appropriate for somebody who was extremely short-sighted.
His capacity to imagine, to visualize multiple dimensions of geometry gave him a unique perspective.
He had to depend very much on learning by ear, and he did develop the most extraordinary ability to do complex mathematics and complex geometrical arguments in his head without writing things down.
It enabled him to make intuitive new connections across areas of science which had been considered distinct. As a biologist and statistician, Alan Graffen shares Fisher's range of interests.
Fisher thought in pictures, and he solved very complicated problems using pictures in his mind. It's possible to imagine that because he couldn't see very well out there in the world, he turned his eyes inward and saw very clearly in his mind. The formulae came out of some deep recesses of his subconscious.
Fisher went up to Cambridge in 1909. His extraordinary insight inspired even his earliest achievements.
When Fisher came up to Caius as a scholar, he will have been allocated a room, and as a scholar it will have been in one of the inner courts, and as it happens, the room in question is next door to the staircase that I'm on now. with that splendid naivety which your 20-year-old will have, he will have just set off on a course solving problems in a way which will have been entirely original to him. And although the method of maximum likelihood can be found in earlier works, it is the development which started on that staircase in 1912, which led to his great 1922 paper on the mathematical foundations of theoretical statistics, from which the modern theory of estimation flows.
The concept of maximum likelihood is one of his best-known developments and is still at the cutting edge of the scientist's search for certainty.
Any method of estimation in statistics, such as the method of maximum likelihood, is a method to teach us how to extract information from data, to find out what we don't know from what we do know in form of data.
At the British headquarters of the Human Genome Project, the Sanger Centre in Cambridge, Richard Durbin leads the team of statisticians.
Ideally in science we want to establish the truth conclusively. Often we only have partial sorts of information, and one of the challenges is how to put together partial information that may not be completely conclusive in itself to give as much certainty as possible. The human genome contains the information that is inherited, that creates a human being from a fertilized egg. And we can think of that as a parts list and an instruction manual for putting together those parts to make a complete human.
Scientists now know the complete human genome sequence, but the code needs to be translated into a usable form. This means analysing the individual genes which make up its component parts.
When we look at the genomic sequence, it's a long string of A's, C's, G's, and T's, just 3 billion letters long. Within that, we know there's around 50 to 100,000 genes, and these are comprised of small segments of the sequence.
Using statistics, Durbin's task is to investigate the nature of unknown genes by applying data from genes which are already understood.
What we want to do is use all the information and evidence that we have to help us find and characterize genes in other parts of the genome where we haven't yet done any experiments. The way we do that is by fitting parameters to a model using maximum likelihood or related techniques. And really the theoretical foundations for this sort of approach were set earlier in the century by Fisher and his colleagues.
Despite these pioneering achievements, Fisher's work is not widely known beyond the scientific community. His perspective and insight are difficult to grasp or to explain simply, familiar obstacles for anyone who tries. The theory of maximum likelihood, for instance.
If you want to draw inferences in the presence of uncertainty, the first leap you have to make is to create certainty in your imagination. But not to create one certainty, create lots of different certainties. And that's not as easy as it sounds. You have to say, well, if this were the case, everything would be certain. Or if that were the case, everything would be certain. Or if the other were the case, everything would be certain. And drawing up that list of possible certainties is the first stage in drawing inferences in the presence of uncertainty. The next stage is to take each possible certainty and to ask, what would happen if that were true? Then the next one, what would happen if that were true? And the next one, what would happen if that were true? And then you look at what really happened, and you look back and say, well, if this were true, how likely is it we'd see what we see now? If the middle thing was true, how likely is it we'd see what we see now? And if the last thing was true, how likely is it that we'd see what we see now? And maximum likelihood is saying, well, which of those possible certainties makes it most likely we'd see what we saw?
Fisher's effortless grasp of abstract ideas is reflected in his writing.
Fisher's writing is extraordinarily tense and close, partly because he would formulate his ideas in his mind and very often dictate everything that he was to publish. His mentor, Leonard Darwin, who was Charles Darwin's fourth son, once wrote to him, "One idea per sentence is a good idea, I think." You have to think hard whilst you're reading.
In this, his most famous book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, Fisher says in the preface, "No efforts of mine could avail to make the book easy reading. We understand it better now than when you wrote it, and as biologists learn more, they'll understand the book better still."
If Fisher's giant steps of thought were ahead of his time, they were not always welcomed by his contemporaries.
New ideas are unexpected, they're difficult to assimilate, they're difficult to act on, and people get quite indignant and angry about them.
You can only tell people things one step away from what they know already. And if you try to go 2 or 3 steps, you lose them and they get cross.
He thought so clearly himself that he had great difficulty in appreciating the lack of clarity, or as he once put it, the dense fog in the minds of the young men around me. The rest of us suffered.
But it wasn't just his students who struggled. The intellectual giants of the day couldn't always keep up with him either.
Poor Pearson, who liked pages and pages of algebra, found that Fisher was coming along and proving his results and saying, "It is obvious that," which is enough to make anybody cross.
The trouble is, he was usually right, but he wasn't always so good at explaining why he was right. When people misunderstood him, he didn't always take it in good part.
He did not tolerate fools gladly, and he could be quite rude. But that is human.
The inner world of his intuition and intellect seemed at odds with the world outside. Despite his best efforts, he wasn't always good at explaining himself.
He had this amazing analytical ability to complete long mathematical arguments in his mind without putting anything down on paper. And frequently he would produce an argument which was correct mathematically and then not be able immediately to reconstruct how he'd arrived at that point.
Fisher had brilliant insight on many matters, and he often chose to explain things in an intuitive way which used a minimal amount of mathematics. And he hoped in this way that his ideas would become comprehensible to a less specialist audience. But the net result often was that the mathematicians didn't understand him either.
Thinking about it in later years, I had the sense that he was probably rather lonely.
While Fisher's perspective on the world may have left him out of kilter with his time, the legacy of his ideas has been phenomenal. Perhaps even he couldn't have dreamt of its scope.
The value of abstraction in solving problems, as Fisher did, is that you begin locally with a particular problem you want to solve, but by thinking about it in a very abstract way, it's like ascending into the stratosphere so that you can then solve all kinds of other problems all over the world with just the same solution as you've just achieved.
Car manufacture is just one of the current applications for the ideas that Fisher developed at Rothamsted. As technology advances, engineers are developing new engine designs which have to take into account an increasing number of factors.
The first thing we're trying to do is produce engines which are environmentally friendly. There's a drive at the moment for having green engines which are very efficient. The other side of the scales, we're really trying to balance that with customer requirements. They're very specific about having engines which have a low fuel consumption, they're energy efficient, and can produce as much power as possible. So it's really trying to get the balance between those major aspects of optimization.
Fisher's methods for designing experiments are at the heart of the complex work of the development team, using pioneering techniques made possible only by the latest computer software.
There's no way we could do this work without computers. The number of factors which we're varying are absolutely astronomical, and using traditional techniques it would take something like 90 years just to visit all of the operation points.
It now takes only 2 weeks to perform the same kind of experiment. Practical tests are used merely to verify and adjust the computer-generated data, creating a virtual model of the engine's performance.
Now this is really useful for us because we can then ask the model what the engine is doing rather than go down to the cell and retest point after point after point.
Computer technology means that Fisher's principles can be easily combined with other concepts of statistics. New software packages can apply the theory of maximum likelihood at the click of a mouse.
From my perspective, it's really useful because coming from an engineering background, I've had to pick up a lot of these statistics, and the software enables someone with a fairly basic understanding of statistics to really get down to some quite state-of-the-art techniques.
While Fisher's contribution to the theory of statistics may ebb and flow with the tide of ideas, there are reasons why his reputation has since been tarnished.
Fisher was not perfect. He had a spectacular mistake regarding smoking, and that was he decided to be clever rather than wise. When Bradford Hill and Richard Doll produced the first evidence linking lung cancer to smoking, Fisher countered that it could in fact be due to genetics.
What he said was, we shouldn't pretend there's certainty when there isn't, and we shouldn't be causing mass scares to the population when actually there was room for doubt about whether or not smoking caused lung cancer. It was a very reasonable position. It was perhaps unfortunate he was funded by the tobacco companies at the time.
Fisher's reputation has also suffered because of his strong convictions about the practical applications of human genetics, known then as eugenics.
Eugenics seeks to apply the known laws of heredity so as to prevent the degeneration of the race and improve its inborn qualities. Not all mental deficiency is hereditary, but heredity accounts for more of the mild, feeble-minded types. But it would have been better by far for them and for the rest of the community if they had never been born.
Though shocking now, the principles of eugenics were widely accepted at the time.
Fisher had a great sense of sort of social responsibility. One of his earliest papers is a rather pious one called Some Hopes of a Eugenist. And he thought that we ought to use genetics in lots of ways, including improving the human condition.
He brought home all sorts of tests for the family. Intelligence tests were being developed. He was very enthusiastic about the blood group work. Eye colours, hair colours. He brought professors of ophthalmology to sort out our genetic traits as far as any genetic traits could be discriminated at the time.
Fisher wrote a number of articles in which he described what sort of political measures could be taken to improve the eugenic stock of Great Britain, for example, providing child allowances so that the right sort of person would in fact have children, to encourage not just the working classes but also the middle classes to have large families.
Whatever we think about Fisher's views on eugenics, some aspects of his hopes for the future are remarkably close to our own. After a lifetime of measuring the unmeasurable, it's only now that his vision is able to become a reality.
Just as nowadays with the Genome Project, there's the idea that we're on the brink of a new era in which we'll be able to use genetics to improve the human condition. Fisher believed that then.
He was the first person to suggest, when he was Professor of Genetics in London, that if only we could develop a linkage map of man, it might be useful for disease prognosis. And in that sense, he and his colleagues at University College in the 1930s are the parents of the Human Genome Project.
Fisher died in 1962, but he had foreseen the far-reaching potential of combining statistics and genetics in the search for certainty. It's this creative synthesis which proved most fruitful during his time at Rothamsted that carries on today.
I feel tremendously privileged to be involved in sequencing the human genome, and I think everyone who works as part of the project feels the same way. Just as Rothamsted was at the cutting edge of collecting genetic data in the 1920s and 1930s, the Sanger Centre is the cutting edge of collecting genetic data now in the new millennium. We know we're producing something that is going to be a foundation for biological science from now on for the next 1,000 years and 5,000 years.
From a deep understanding of who we are to the way we live our lives, statistics has a crucial role in our future, thanks in large part to the work of R.A. Fisher.
Fisher could hardly have dreamt how his ideas would be used today.
His influence is so pervasive that everything you do in statistics and everything you do in evolutionary biology can really be said to be Fisherian.
He was a genius, of course. He followed his own bent.